Good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Christopher Sands and I'm director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. As many of you know, 11 months ago, the governments of the United States and Canada began restricting access to the border for essential traffic only. And while that kept commercial traffic going, it separated families, friends, and many other people from the occasions and loved ones that make life worth living. As a result, as the months have gone on, the border restrictions have imposed a very heavy cost on many individuals. The Woodrow Wilson Center has created a task force on public health and the US-Canadian border. Our goal is to try to look at how we reconcile being safe with COVID-19 pandemic in the wind, but also how we can continue to have the border remain one of our major connector points between the United States and Canada. On his first day in office, President Biden signed an executive order on promoting COVID-19 safety in domestic and international travel, giving multiple agencies and departments the border file, including the Department of Labor, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Homeland Security, and of course, the Transportation Security Administration. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, they have less than a month to develop a science-based approach to safe travel within the United States and internationally. What safe policies options are on the table? What are some of the key issue areas? How are governments engaging? And what are the stories that would justify reducing the restrictions on the border? For this, we've been able to come to a group called Us Reunite, a grassroots group of Americans and Canadians who have sought to have an influence on US border policy, Canadian border policy, and restore the openness of the border. Our first panel includes the leadership of Let Us Reunite, Devon Weber, founder, and Cary Whaley, co-founder of Let Us Reunite. I'm going to turn it over to Devon first to tell us about the group and how you got started.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for having us today. And thank you to the Wilson Center's Canada Institute for your interest and attention to this problem that's often overlooked when we think about the border closing. I'll give you a little background, I guess, on myself first. I'm a New Yorker living in Montreal. I moved to Montreal last February, about 6 weeks before the border closed. This was obviously not something that any of us saw coming, Americans, Canadians, anyone. So obviously I moved here because I have a French Canadian husband and I had a then 5-month-old son. So I pretty obsessively watched any news about the border closing. Every month it would roll over on the 21st of every month. A few days before, we would get the notice that the border was going to be closed again. And, those first few months of the pandemic for all of us was sort of a blur, but it was very upsetting. I wanted my son to know his parents. So over the summer, I became aware of a group here in Canada that was called Faces of Advocacy, and they were doing outreach to the Canadian government to get travel exemptions so people could come visit their loved ones in Canada. And so I joined the group and I learned about it and I realized there was no one doing the same advocacy on the US side. I happen to have a background in that. I've spent the last 15 years of my career working in politics and campaigns, doing legislative advocacy and issue-based advocacy. So I have the tools and the knowledge and the skills to do that. And so on a whim, back in October, I started a Facebook group to see if there were other people that were impacted by this and wanted to, sort of organize and work for change overnight. We had 800 members of the group, which is sort of a dream for any sort of grassroots advocacy kind of campaign. And today, 4 months later, we represent about 2,000 families in the US and Canada that are directly impacted by the land border closure.
That's impressive. Cary, how did you get involved?
So my background, first on the personal side, I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, have worked in financial services advocacy on the legislative and regulatory side. But I'm in a 14-year committed relationship with my partner who lives right outside of Ottawa. Again, because of the closure, I was looking every week, every month for how is this going to change. I mean, the worst part about the closure is not the protractedness, it's the indefinite. It's that it's indefinite. There's no timeline. We don't know. So meanwhile, I'm looking, because I own property in Canada and Mary and I share a house together. I'm looking at the property ownership side of it, thinking US can never define what a committed relationship looks like. I know US government stumbles sometimes on definitions. Committed relationships hard to define. And one day, as I'm looking at the website Faces of Advocacy and realizing they're never going to be able to define it, one day I realized, hey, they defined it. They came up with a clear definition, 1 year committed relationship, and that the significant other has to file an affidavit saying that, yes, I've been in that relationship. And Canada passed an exemption. This was back, the second exemption, which is the extended family, was in October. So I was able to visit there once for the month of November. But now we're in a situation, I mean, as does, you cannot, it's not nimble enough to travel. And so family emergencies have come and gone. And again, it's that indefinite, I feel like I've left my partner without a partner. So part of this was, once they had that win in October, I see that someone was starting a group, and I was like, hey, I can put my skill set to use here.
That's excellent. Let me ask you both, can you give us a sense of how the two federal governments have responded to your outreach, trying to give them some input and influence them? Maybe in contradistinction to each other, was one government more responsive? Were they both the same and non-responsive? What was the reaction once you got started? Devon, maybe you could start.
Yeah, so actually, I think it's important to sort of maybe define what our campaign is a little bit here. So our campaign is very narrowly focused. We are strictly lobbying the US government to reciprocate the travel exemptions that Canada has already put into place. So as Cary mentioned, back in June, they put into place, the Canadian government put into place a set of exemptions to allow immediate family to be able to visit. And then in October, they expanded that to allow extended family, and there's sort of a process by which you have to apply to get a travel exemption. The US government has done nothing. So we are not lobbying the Canadian government at all as part of our group. We are strictly lobbying the US government to reciprocate those same family travel exemptions.
And would you characterize the response so far as having been good, bad, indifferent?
Oh, the responses have been overwhelmingly positive. This is the most bipartisan issue I have ever worked on in my career. It doesn't matter if we're meeting with Republicans, we're meeting with Democrats. They understand this issue. They understand the pain that their constituents are going through. Like, even before we started our campaign in October, people were doing outreach on their own. People are so desperate to see their family. By the time October of last year rolled around, they had been hearing from their constituents, you know, on a pretty regular basis, hoping to open the border. So we just sort of galvanized all of that energy and created an organized campaign to do that. But the result, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. It was more of a question of what can be done back then and what can be done now. And I think there is, in the new era with the new administration, there is a renewed hope, a renewed energy that like we can actually get movement on this issue that we just maybe didn't have in October for a number of reasons, including just the fatigue and everyone still dealing with the initial impact of the coronavirus.
Cary, do you want to expand on that or respond?
Yeah, I just want to double back. In your intro, you talked about the process of opening the border. We really feel like this issue is a pre-process, that even before you have those discussions, there's a simple step that the United States government can take, and that is reciprocate these family exemptions, both the immediate and the extended family. And it's a simple way. It also provides momentum. And, that's what we're lacking right now is momentum in the discussion. And I think it's a simple good faith gesture. Um, Canada, Canada provided these exemptions, and it would be natural for us to reciprocate.
That's excellent. Let me ask about just from a policy point of view. Canada focuses so much on the US border, and of course there's the air border to Europe and Asia, but the land border with the US is clearly Canada's #1 border to work on. The United States has 2 major land borders, and of course lots of other ways to enter the country. To what extent do you think that the US-Mexico border has been either complicating efforts to make the US-Canadian border different, or perhaps it has a similar echo? Are there groups that you know of that are trying to do US-Mexico border crossing in the same way?
So I did a lot of outreach back in the beginning to try to answer that question to see if there were any groups. So the executive order that closed down the US Canadian land border is the same one that closed down the US Mexico land border. It was a separate executive order than the ones that have closed the air borders to various sort of countries all over the world. I was unable to find any group specifically dealing on the US-Mexico border with sort of what we're doing here. There's obviously a lot of groups that are dealing with other sort of family separation issues. On the US-Mexico border, we couldn't find anyone doing this, though I have to imagine that there are families in the very same sort of situation on the US-Mexico border. In terms of your question of the complication in it, I mean, our understanding from the conversations we've had with various members of Congress is that even though they were shut down by the same executive order, it doesn't mean they have to be opened by the same executive order. Like, I can't speak to any administration thoughts on that, but doesn't seem to be anything legally requiring them to open them at the same time.
And to make for people who are encountering this for the first time, some states, for example, have allowed people to visit but required a quarantine period or other obligations. In your campaign, are you addressing the issues of quarantines and other requirements, or for you, is it mainly the crossing that is most important?
I mean, so like you said, there's no federally mandated quarantine policy in the United States. Our campaign, we're obviously a small grassroots campaign. There's Cary and myself and the 2,000 members we have. We just don't have the time or the bandwidth to lobby every single individual state government. There's 50 of them. We are focused strictly on getting those exemptions. And we've always said, these are our family. We don't want to get any of them sick. We care very much about them. And so, we want to make sure that we adhere to any state, local, federal policy. I mean, my parents just left from Canada back to New York last week. So they're in the middle of another 2-week quarantine in New York State, so it's not ideal, but right now we really need to focus on just getting that exemption. So quarantine's even an issue.
Yeah, I think the key thing, Chris, is that we keep it safe. And we're not trying to affect cause more spread. What we're trying to do is reunite with our families and deal with some of the other health issues that come along with when your families are separated, because there's very real issues that happen when you pull families apart.
Cary, I know, like myself, you live in Maryland, which is not actually a border state. In terms of the dynamics within your group, are you finding there are people who are in the actual border states for whom it used to be a more daily occurrence to be able to go to Canada versus people a little away from the border? Is the feeling different, or is it really much the same?
We have, and I'm speaking for both Devon and ourselves, we have become connoisseurs of the border towns. And we've learned more about each individual border crossing than we ever knew going in. That you have communities such as Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Ontario, that it's a 10-minute, 15-minute drive across the border. And suddenly, because the air border is still open, the only way you're going to be able to reunite is probably by a 10 to 12 hour travel nightmare, through multiple hubs. And it's just not practical for a lot of the families. Devon, you can talk a little bit about the piece about the Vancouver.
The Peace Arch. Well, I think just to go back to your initial question there, Chris, obviously the bulk of our membership does exist in these border towns because, like you said, they travel every day. But we have members in Texas, we have members in Florida, in California. There's someone in our group that lives in Hawaii. I mean, this is something that, you know, you can't help who you fall in love with. You can't help who your family with. The world that we live in is so interconnected that we really do see members from all over the country. But yes, if you are used to, you know, it's a 5-minute drive to drop your kids at your grandparents' house from Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan to Sault Ste. Marie, you know, Ontario, obviously that's going to have a little bit of greater impact than someone that might only, you know, fly once or twice a year. I'm sorry, now I've forgotten what your other question was.
Just, I guess, just contrasting, you know, the border state experience versus people more in the interior. For example, and I think, Cary, you touched on this, the idea that the border crossing is by airport, where you go through a sort of normal channel, versus the land border where you're in there with all of the trucks. Are those kinds of differences reflected in your campaign, or are you all modal, as it were?
So we are focused strictly on the land border because there are absolutely no restrictions to fly from Canada to the United States. You can fly to see your family. You could fly for a bachelorette party if you wanted to. Right now, we are focused strictly on the land crossing because there is no exemption. There is not a single way. My husband and I could not, if something, God forbid, happened to my family tomorrow, my husband would not be alive to drive down to New York with me. He would have to get on a plane and fly to New York, which obviously there's more health risks, right? Like if you are going to be in your own car and you're driving from point A to point B, maybe just to stop, get gas, your exposure to COVID is much lower than if you have to take an airplane where you're going through security, you're in an enclosed space, even though the travel, the numbers have shown that traveling does not spread COVID as much as, say, the community spread is. It's still something that's scary. And if you're immunocompromised, if you're going to visit someone immunocompromised, it's a non-starter. You can't do it. I'm not going to get on a plane and go to visit my mother who has, asthma.
Yeah. And speaking for my partner, because she has a pre-existing condition that puts her at very, very high risk, flying is a non-starter.
On things like that, I know a lot of times we worry about sharing health information, and certain workplaces, I know my own, will require you to do a COVID test. How do you see testing and sharing of information as a sort of pre-qualifier to be able to cross the border, or even contact tracing once you've crossed? Or have those issues been part of your campaign? Have you thought about how those might be integrated?
They really haven't been part of our campaign. We have let both governments and the municipalities decide what safe is. And then, we do, from my standpoint, while it wasn't required, because I care about my significant other, you better believe I had a couple tests during my visit to make sure I wasn't bringing anything. But as far as a policy standpoint, that's not a part of the policy that we dive into.
Excellent. Well, we have a question from one of our viewers, and it's a good time for me to remind those of you who are watching this live. Obviously, the recording won't work, but if you're watching this live, you can send in your questions for this panel and the subsequent panel by emailing us at canada@wilsoncenter.org. That's Canada@wilsoncenter, one word, .org. And if you're watching from Canada, I have to admit, it's Wilson Center spelled the American way, not RE, the Canadian way. So please do send in your questions. We have a question here. Do you foresee a scenario where you could present recent negative test results when crossing the border by car, and then be able to do a same-day visit without an overnight stay. Is that something that that you've heard contemplated or have any reaction to?
I mean, we haven't really dived into the specifics of the policy that much. You know, that is not the goal of our campaign, is to get these travel exemptions, period. Of course, we would love them to be as flexible as possible, given that, you know, 14-day quarantines are not obviously something that everyone can do, but we are not pushing any specific policy about testing, about length of visits, other than we want to make sure that whatever is implemented is easy to understand and sort of easy to apply for. So there's not a bunch of bureaucracy that's going to keep someone from seeing their family.
Yeah, Chris, I would add that that's a long haul problem. In the immediate short haul is that we've got to deal with families being able to reunite. Then the various governments, because this is we're in COVID for the long haul, we're going to have to get smarter by the way that we do it and continue to leverage our knowledge of COVID to make progresses. But that's not within the bounds of our campaign. What we're trying to do is deal with this short-term problem that there's no momentum and the border is closed right now.
Let me ask another question, which really relates to specifically to people who are crossing the border for a medical reason. A lot of people in Canada will come to U.S. hospitals, or they have a treatment that they're used to doing on the other side of the border. How have medical exemptions been handled? Are they part of your campaign, or are they even more a special case, as you were saying, Cary?
So right now, the way that the policy is written, if you are a Canadian that has an essential medical appointment on the other side of the border, you are allowed to cross. Now, that is in theory. In practice, we have unfortunately heard many stories of people being denied the ability to cross the border to get medical equipment for their children that they can't get in Canada, to have doctor's appointments. And I think one of the most upsetting is that there are people in Canada that have partners in the United States who have to have some sort of have had a medical emergency, have had to have surgery, and their partners have not been able to cross the border to take care of them. And I think that is something that would be addressed by our campaign, because hopefully we would be able to have the same kind of compassion exemptions that Canada has that would allow you to immediately cross the border to see your loved ones.
And Chris, I think that brings another point on the exemptions, that any exemptions, there needs to be comprehensive training for the Border Patrol to be able to know the ins and outs of the exemptions.
Absolutely. I want to maybe draw a contrast between where you started your two stories. I know, Devon, you were thinking immediately about family connections, and Cary, you introduced the idea of being a homeowner or a property owner in both countries. Could you outline maybe, and I'll go to you first, Devon, what would be the ideal situation for family compassion exemptions? How should they apply? How should they be? What should be the requirement of information to justify the exemption? What's reasonable on that side? And then, Cary, I'll ask you about property owners, because I think that's a slightly different case.
So I would say, I mean, in a perfect world, in an ideal world, it would be great if we didn't have to apply for something. If we have to create some sort of a government process in which you submit your information and have to wait to hear back, I think that's going to take a long time. That's going to be something that is going to be very burdensome. There's going to be a cost associated with that, because the people who have to process them have to be paid. So in an ideal world, it would be great if there was some sort of a list of something you could bring to prove your relationship. So in Canada, for the immediate family exemptions, there is no application process. If you are the immediate family member of a Canadian or a permanent resident, you just have to bring proof of your relationship. So my parents had to bring a copy of my birth certificate and a copy of my permanent resident card and a copy of my photo ID, so they could prove that they were my parents, which it's a little crazy way to dig on my birth certificate, but on the whole, that was not that hard. If you're an extended family member, which would be my brother, he would have to go through the process of applying through Canada's, it's called the IRCC, which is their sort of refugee and agent. Sorry, it's the agency that processes their visas here. Basically, you have to put together a whole thing to prove your relationship, how long you're going to be, and then you have to wait 14 days to get that back. If you're lucky, they say 14 days. We have seen people that have waited 2 or 3 months. I would love for there not to be that process. If my brother could show up, or at the border with a copy of his birth certificate, I don't know how you prove that, and we are willing to have conversations if anyone at DHS would have those conversations with us. But I think to make it as simple as possible, so as many people as possible, we're coming up on the 1-year mark. The people just want to see their families, and we don't want to create any bureaucracy that's going to delay that any longer. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, Cary, owning property does come with usually a title or some piece of paper that says you own it. Has that been dealt with at all? Is there any for property owners who want to visit their cottage or make sure it's ready for the winter now that we're getting cold weather? What has been the response on property owners?
Well, first, let me be really clear. This is not in the scope of the campaign. What I would point the listeners to is the Northern Border Caucus by Brian Higgins and Elise Stefanik released a very good letter with 24 signers that had 5 points. One was establish a binational plan for restoring travel, prioritizing vaccines and testing for border staff, allowing families to safely reunite, which we were extremely happy about. The fifth point was developing fourth point was developing a policy for property owners. And the last was reciprocal access to transit through boundary waters. I would point people towards that property owner section. I think there's a lot of good work, but that is not what Let Us Reunite is about. We're about reunited families.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are watching this outside the Beltway, when we talk about a Northern Border Caucus, it's members of the U.S. House of Representatives who have organized a caucus to look at Northern Border issues. And Representative Stefanik and Representative Higgins, both from New York, but a Republican and a Democrat, have really been championing it. But I know it includes a number of other members from other states as well. And you can find those members through your normal outreach to Congress, reaching congressional offices, just marking that you're interested in sharing this with the Northern Border Caucus. Now, one of the questions we've had from our audience is maybe it jumps into our next section, but in terms of some of the stories that motivated you to get involved. I know we have some stories coming up a little bit later, but maybe you could reflect on your own stories or those of your own immediate family. And I know, Cary, you made that comment about training for officers. And nobody wants to be the frontline person who has to deal with someone who's upset that they can't do something they need to do. How much pressure is this put on officers at the border or TSA agents? Are they in the unhappy position of enforcing an unpopular policy, or are they fully on board with the policy and wish people would stop trying to press their luck?
Well, this allows me to speak from my own standpoint of someone that traveled to Canada on the exemptions. And the first border agent was really not familiar with the policy. He was familiar with the paperwork, but some of the nuances caused a red flag. So it was lengthy, but the second agent was totally well trained. I think there's going to be an issue on both sides of making sure, as we get smarter on this issue, that everybody keeps up with the changes, because this is going to evolve. It's going to start hopefully with an exemption, but it's going to evolve past then. So we all have to be prepared to be nimble and to get smarter and learn throughout the process.
Devon, what's been your experience with the enforcement sort of front line of this? Have you found that has been made things worse to some extent, or has it been more cooperative with people understanding, just not able to say yes if the rules haven't been changed from the top down?
I can't speak to it personally. I haven't been to the United States now in over a year, which is insane when I think about it. Anecdotally, we hear this from my members all the time, right? Um, that something happens, there's a medical emergency, someone has to have a child has to have an operation, so their partner has tried to cross the border, and they're not allowed. And I mean, we've heard everything, right? I can't speak to Customs and Border Patrol as a whole, but we have definitely had stories of members that have had sympathetic agents that say, this is the policy, I'm sorry, I wish I could let you across, but unfortunately, my job, and we understand it's their job to enforce the policy. My father's a Customs and Border Patrol officer my entire life. Like they're doing their jobs, and we don't blame them for doing their jobs. And that's why we are lobbying Congress to work with the administration to change so they don't, this isn't on the shoulders of these border officers, right? That there's a policy that they can point to that says, yes, you are the father of an American child, you were allowed to come into this country via the land border.
Let me ask you on that. I understand your focus is on the U.S. government, but what about the Canadian government? Have you found that Canada has been willing to back you in taking this onto the diplomatic relationship? Prime Minister Trudeau has spoken now with both President Biden and Vice President Harris. Do you have a sense that this is on Canada's agenda, or are they expecting from the grassroots that you'll carry this, particularly because there's so many American citizens involved, that may be the better route?
I think first and foremost, we have to point to the family exemptions that showed incredible leadership. And more importantly, by the second step, the extended family, it recognized that family comes in different shapes and sizes. And there shouldn't be a one size fits all. Just because there's not a marriage certificate doesn't mean that it's not a committed partnership. And I think the leadership they showed by creating those exemptions should never be downplayed.
Devon?
No, I think I agree with what Cary said. I mean, we have our very strong champions in Congress. We have, people like Congressman Brian Higgins. We have, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence from Michigan, who just on Friday put out a letter asking President Biden, with other members of the Michigan delegation, to make family travel exemptions a priority. I think it's really incumbent upon us as an organization and the members here to make sure that their voices are heard. We really just have to focus on making sure this is a priority. Unfortunately, I think you probably know this, Chris, in your job, that Canada is sort of sometimes forgotten in the United States. They're sort of, as someone who, this is my second time living in Canada, people know that it exists, but it is not a priority. When you think of all of the other countries and everything going on in the world right now, the US-Canadian land border, I don't think it's on anyone's top 10 list. That isn't in this group or probably watching this stream right now. It's just not something that is registering with them. And that's why we have been pushing really hard, not only with Congress, but to get these stories out in the media, to make sure that people realize there's not only an economic impact to the border closure, there's a personal toll on these families that have been apart for a year.
And I would just stress, Chris, on the flip side of that, every single Canadian knows the border's closed.
Yeah, indeed. All right, so I have a couple more questions, and then I know we want to hear from the stories that we have from some of the people who've been involved with your campaign. There is a question that's come in. It's very, very straightforward. I have been vaccinated. How does that affect travel into Canada? Has there been any policy for people who have been vaccinated, the lucky few who've managed to make it and actually not on the right list, but also have managed to get the vaccine? Is there any incorporation of that into the way that the United States handles border entry?
To my knowledge, no, there has been no there is no current policy about those that are vaccinated, because from my understanding, from what I've read, they're still unsure about your ability to spread the virus. And I know that they're waiting for that. So there is no, unfortunately, vaccinated or not, doesn't matter. The travel exemptions and the travel restrictions are the same.
And is that the same for going into Canada?
Yes.
Excellent.
And obviously that's got to be part of the dialogue. But to be clear, what we're looking for happens before the dialogue. It can happen tomorrow.
Mhm.
If you make those reciprocal, this can start reuniting families far before the dialogue, and it shouldn't wait for the dialogue to complete or to commence.
One of the things I love about working with the Wilson Center is that our Wilson Center audiences are very interesting and challenging. And so I have a question, which is it's a compound question. So let's see how we can do this. It's a question to see if you would say that these sentences are true or not true. So this is sort of truth or consequences, the Wilson Center edition. So the first question, is this statement true or not true? All non-essential border travel at land crossings is prohibited by both governments. True or not true?
That is not true.
Excellent. Devon, what's wrong about that statement? All non-essential border travel at land crossings is prohibited by both governments.
So coming into the U.S. government, there's to the U.S. there are restrictions. However, there are exemptions. If you're a dual citizen, you can freely travel across the border. Also, if you're a legal resident, so if you have a work permit, if you're a green card holder, you are allowed to cross the border. If you have what's called an Indian status card, you're allowed to cross the border. Those same things are true into Canada as well, but Canada also has family travel exemptions. None of those things are considered essential.
I will just point out, since I know a few of my own students, if you have a student visa to study at university,
Yes.
that is another category. Yes,
Absolutely.
excellent.
And
That one.
Cary?
I would point out that we wrote a letter to President Biden urging him to classify these exemptions as essential,
Mhm.
because family, there is nothing more essential than family. And then urging the Canadian government in the dialogue to consider doing the same. That right now, yes, it's not essential, but there is nothing more essential than families.
Very true. And I know Canadians don't have this experience, but in Washington, D.C., when the government shuts down, it often says essential workers can continue to show up and non-essentials should not. And always it makes me feel bad because I'm not really very essential to anything. So we could have come up with a term that doesn't seem so judgy about you and your relationships. But anyway, bygones be. I'm not hurt. I'm not taking this person. All right, next question from this cluster of questions. True or not, non-essential border travel by other means, for example, airplane, by US citizens was prohibited by the Canadian government into Canada, but was modified this summer to allow for reunification of family members with quarantine provisions. It's a complicated question. Is that true or not true? First of all, I guess I should break it up. Was there a ban on non-essential border travel by not the land border, by plane, by US citizens up until a certain point? Was that ever off the table?
Yes, Canada closed their borders completely, not just to the US, but to other countries as well. So that is
Excellent.
correct.
And then it was modified this summer, is that correct, to allow reunification of family members with, of course, quarantine provisions for going into Canada? I guess that's the opposite of what you've been working on.
Yeah. Oh, so yeah. So these are what we've been talking about, the Canada family travel exemptions. Yes. So that's correct.
Excellent. All right. Two true. All right. One last one. Let's see if this is non-essential border travel by other means, i.e. airplane, by Canadian citizens was and is allowed by the United States government into the US with deference to state restrictions in terms of quarantine. Is that accurate?
So
Go ahead.
no, go ahead, Cary. I think I understand the question, but maybe Cary understands
I
it.
think I understand it. What I would add is what Devon said earlier, that you can travel to the US via air for any reason. There is no closure of the air borders.
And as far as you're aware, no tests that you have to do before you can enter?
Yes, on starting January 26th, the US did implement a COVID test required 3 days taken no more than 3 days prior to your travel to be able to enter the United States via plane.
Excellent. All right. Thank you for clarifying that. Another question from our audience. Do you believe that as part of your campaign, if you would offer solutions to allowing family members to cross the border, that DHS would be more receptive to allowing exemptions? If you offer solutions. Oh, I guess the point of this question, if I'm just reading it for the first time, is that do you feel in your campaign the burden of trying to find ways to solve the problem for DHS, or is your campaign mainly presenting not so much the solution that you want, but the problem that you want addressed, and leaving it to DHS and other agencies to devise policy? How far into the policy design have you got?
So we, at the request of Brian Higgins' office back in January, we put together a transition memo for the then Biden-Harris transition team, sort of outline what the problem at the border was and what we saw as the solution, which is basically a reciprocation of Canada's travel exemptions. I think that's what the question is asking.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yes, we're not just presenting a problem and saying, here, you solve it. That would be a very bad campaign on any level. Though it might be a more fun campaign if you didn't have to get into the policy weeds. But yes, our solution is travel exemptions. We are not telling them how necessarily on a granular level they should be implemented, but what we are asking for is immediate and extended family travel exemptions to the border closure.
But we would love to work with anybody that's trying to implement that. Once the order is given out to DHS to reciprocate the family exemptions, we welcome him. We'd love to provide input.
So far, no. Well, another question, and I think you've been clear on this, but just to clarify, I guess specifically, when it comes to day trips, shopping, tourism, some of the things that people have talked about, that's beyond the scope of what you're taking on. And yeah,
we're not. We hope that one day in the greater, border opening, we want to get back to normalcy. I would love to be able to go across the border to Vermont and go to Trader Joe's and get groceries, but that is not the focus of our campaign. We're really strictly looking in a very narrow lane at family travel exemptions. We understand that COVID-19 is a deadly disease. We are not negating that, but we think that the mental health of our members is important too. And we think that there is a way that you can be safe, take into account the safety needed to travel with the COVID restrictions and still be able to see our loved ones.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. And another quick question, actually, from someone who had my job once, the great David Biet, who's watching. I hope I'm living up to his high standards, but he asked, have you looked at what other countries have done? Has there been, for example, any example in Europe or in another part of the world where there has been a better system for handling family connections, family reunification? Anything you're aware of? Obviously, you may or may not be.
I mean, I'll take a shot at this. We've really stayed focused on, because you have this robust set of exemptions, we stayed laser focused on that. It's possible that those exemptions could be applied to other nations and other travel, but that's not within our scope. What we're trying to do is pave the way and reciprocate those exemptions. Should they be reciprocated then to other nations? It's a good framework. They're sound definitions, particularly the fact that they actually defined what an extended family and committed relationship is. So I think it's a good place to start internationally, but we've stayed laser focused with the northern border.
And I would just add that there are other examples of this. Canada is not the only country that has created travel exemptions. So there is precedence for this in other nations. Whether or not they're better or worse than Canada's, I can't speak to, but there are other nations besides Canada that have created travel exemptions for families.
There's an interesting question here, and then I know we want to get to the stories, but I wanted to pick this one up. Viewer says, they have a Nexus card, the program that just works for Canada, US, for which they, in applying, gave biometric support. Does this mean that I don't have to give biometrics when it comes to connecting with extended family, that the Nexus card for regular crossers requires a lot of data sharing? Are you suggesting that for families to come and get back together, there's no card, there's no biometric proof that you are who you say you are? You're just looking for a categorical exception rather than a special travel card or permit. I think I have that right.
Right. We're looking at proof of family. We're not trying to get into biometrics or health sides of it. Could that be part of the larger discussion? Again, that's long term, but for the short haul, no, we're just looking at proof of family.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing that I would add is that whatever we're asking for doesn't override what's already required to enter the United States. So if you obviously need your passport or your enhanced driver's license at the border. I know for some folks, if you are PR in Canada, but you're from another country, a third country, you may have to apply for some sort of visa. Whatever we're asking for doesn't override that. It's just sort of, unfortunately, an extra added thing that you would need to cross the border.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, I really appreciate you coming and sharing your experience with this campaign, and even more that you've identified some members of Let Us Reunite, of your coalition, to tell some of their stories. And I appreciate both your helping us to find them, but also each of them for opening up and sharing what's been happening to them. Can I turn first now to Rachel Moreno from Washington State? Rachel?
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Hi.
What's happened with you?
Well, almost a year ago, I was separated from my partner who lives in St. Catharines. So we're exactly an hour away from each other. We both have children. I have 2 little girls, and he has a son and daughter. And we've been in a relationship for the past 2.5 years. So we've gotten to know each other's families very well. Our kids get along great. And being separated has just taken a big toll out on us, especially myself and my 2 little girls who, he's my big supporter, but he's like a father figure to my girls, because they've had a very rocky relationship with their biological father over the last year, especially. So we actually have something in our house. It's called the Dino Pillow. Dean is the name of my partner. They call him Dino. Most recently, they've asked to call him Daddo. So the pillow actually circulates through our house, and I actually brought it with me today. It says, "Hug this pillow until you can hug me again."
Wow. And how long has it been since they've seen him? Your
We
dog?
see him on FaceTime, but it's been a year almost.
Yeah. No, it's not. Well, I'm sure our viewers will feel this as well. I mean, here we are having an event online. It's good, but it's not the same. It's just not the same.
Not when you're missing holidays, special occasions, and your little kids shouldn't be asking Santa, to bring over, somebody that they look to as a male figure, if they have time, bring them for Christmas because they miss him. And when I left today, I asked my 10-year-old, I said, if there's anything you want the public to know, what would that be? And she said, we want our missing piece back.
Absolutely. Very moving. Very moving. And you didn't mention how old they were, but in talking to children, how do you explain it? Obviously, they've heard of COVID. You can't not. They know there's a pandemic. Their probably school has been somewhat rearranged as well. How do you explain the division, that this is causing at the border, especially for kids who might be young enough they haven't done a lot of international travel, perhaps except for Canada?
Yes. I have a little daughter who's 5, and he has a son who's 5. I have a 10-year-old and he has a daughter who's 7. And in explaining to them, we just say as soon as we can, we'll see each other, that, unfortunately, this is a sad time, but this isn't forever.
Mhm.
So we just have to get through it.
Absolutely. Well,
And just reassuring them that we're there for them and we're not going anywhere.
I hope you won't go anywhere. I'm going to move on to our next story, but please stay here because I'm sure we're going to have people from the audience who would like to hear more from you. And thank you so much for sharing, obviously, a very moving personal story.
Thank you.
It'll stick with me for quite a while, I suspect. Our next member of the coalition is Aaron Atram, who is coming to us from Michigan, my home state, in fact. Aaron?
Hi, Chris.
Hello. Where are you in Michigan, by the way?
I'm in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, so right on the border of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. I live in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan with my husband, Jeremy, and our 2 children. We have a 3-year-old and a 9-month-old. I moved over here in 2016 when we got married. I'm actually from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. All of my family's there. I work there, and all of my friends are there. So when the border closed down in March, that was quite tough for me because I actually cross between 5 to 7 times a week. I even have had some days where I cross more than once.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother lives over in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Unfortunately, my father passed away in March from leukemia right before the border closed. We were in Florida at the time. By the time we got home from Florida, the border had closed and we were not able to cross to see my mother. I'm able to cross being a Canadian, but my husband was not able to cross. My children weren't able to cross, and at the time we didn't cross to see my mom. We weren't able to have a service for my dad. I wasn't able to see my brothers at the time, so it's been a very difficult situation. We ended up waiting until October to finally have a service for my dad and get some closure there. But it's been very difficult being separated from my mother. My son was born in April. He was born 11 weeks early, and he was in the hospital for 3.5 months. And my mother was not able to come to be with us, to meet our son, to help in any way, to help with my daughter. My husband and I were never able to go to the hospital at the same time. One of us had to watch our daughter, the other one was at the hospital. So having the border closed has it's been extremely difficult for my family.
When we talked earlier about border communities, this was some of what came to mind, because when you are in those situations, things like helping your mom now on her own, having her come babysit when you and your husband need to do things like that, are what we rely on family for, and in a very acute way when you're very close to the border, somewhat different if they're farther away. And your son has never lived with anything else. He was born under these restrictions, and hopefully will live long after they go away. Have you found, because you're able to cross, have you found that has, since you're an eyewitness to all of this, has that added to risk? Have you been concerned about your ability to spread things, or have you felt that maybe, given that you've done it successfully and responsibly, that it wouldn't be a stretch for your kids or even your husband to come with you based on your relationship, your citizenship in Canada?
I mean, our family's very safe. Since my son, with the medical conditions he was born with, he was early, plus had some medical issues. So we're very, very safe regardless of COVID. So I know there was the big stigma about, the rate of COVID in the US, and a lot of times at the border, the agents would really give me a hard time coming across because I am coming from a higher population. But my husband and I, our kids, we're very safe. We wear our masks. We don't associate with a lot of people, and I've been able to cross. They've been able to cross. My husband only one time for my father's funeral on the compassionate leave. They did amend it so that my children were able to come with me. I actually was denied in May. My daughter and I both tried to go to see my mom for Mother's Day, and she was denied entry and was not allowed to come with me. But I think we make a great example of people being safe and just wanting to see their family. We do everything we can. We quarantine for 14 days when we go there. I don't like it, but that's what we have to do to be safe for my mom. My mother is 66 years old. We would never want to pass anything on to her. But I think a lot of people are just trying to navigate the pandemic as best they can by being safe and still being able to see their family. So I think we make a good case for how you can successfully do it and how it can successfully be done on the US side as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that comes through so powerfully in your story, that what you're asking for is not, carte blanche to do whatever you want. You're willing to take responsible measures in order to qualify to cross. You want to be safe. It's just that right now the decision about whether your travel is allowed or not is made, without regard to what you're doing to try to be safe. It's just made in the abstract, either in Ottawa or in Washington, which has got to be frustrating.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we've had a room set up for my mom since we moved into our new place and got our son home from the hospital since July, and we're just waiting for her to be able to come over and stay with us. She's on her own now. She doesn't have any family over there. We're sitting 10 minutes away, and she needs our support. We're supporting her through FaceTimes and the few visits that we do get to go over there for. But her being able to come over here, it's not a difficult thing to ask for, to come and stay with us and for us to be able to support her in this difficult time in her life right now.
Mm-hmm. And we've heard so many stories about families that have formed bubbles where they've kind of relocated, and for your mom to be with you in Michigan, whatever the incidence rate is, at least she'd have more support and could join your bubble for a period of time without necessarily risking anyone else, I would think.
Yeah, she's more than happy to follow any guidelines that we have to. Like we discussed, there is no quarantine policy, in Michigan or in many of the states, but she would get a COVID test if she needed to. She would quarantine for 14 days if she had to. She just wants to be with her family and wants to be able to. She's only met my son a handful of times. With my daughter, my parents used to watch her once a week. They used to come over every weekend, and now she's limited to seeing them every couple months, and that's just not enough for her.
No, it's a very moving story. Thank you, Erin, for sharing it, and I hope you'll stay as well, because I know we're having some questions that are already coming in from our audience, so we'll come back to you in a moment. I want to get to our very last member of the coalition, Bobby Hudson, who is joining us from Maine, the great state of Maine.
Hi, Chris. Actually, I'm in Washington State.
But you have a Maine story?
Rachel's on the other coast. But thank you, Chris. Yeah, I live in Olympia, Washington with my 2 teenage children. A little bit about our story since this all happened. So their schools closed on March 13th of last year and have not reopened. I direct a small nonprofit research institution, and I'm lucky I was able to transition to working from home. But like so many others, it has been incredibly stressful to balance my home and my work life, especially without the presence of my Canadian partner. So my partner lives on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. He's actually a shellfish farmer. So his business has suffered tremendously because of markets and the pandemic and restaurant closures. But his work continues. So farm work doesn't pause. He simply just has to do more with less. So our relationship has always revolved around time on or near the water, where we live pretty quiet lives in coastal areas and share our homes across the international border we never imagined would be closed to us. We never imagined that our governments would tell us that our family isn't essential and prohibit our ability to be together as the family that we are. And like Rachel, my two teenage children, they need the support and influence of my partner's gentle, consistent presence in their lives. And instead, because of the border closure, he's been forced to abandon them. And it's heartbreaking. So he has only been able to visit us 2 times since the border closed 10 months ago. He was forced to fly through major airports, Vancouver International and SeaTac International. And that air travel presented risks that he never would have otherwise taken, but that was the only way he could come to see us. So I guess I would say that our situation is painful and has caused tremendous mental anguish. So I did obtain the extended family exemption to enter Canada, but I was part of that advocacy campaign, and it took months of blood, sweat, and tears to petition the government to obtain that exemption. And since then, I've been able to travel to Vancouver Island 2 times via the land border in Blaine, Washington. But all my usual modes of transportation where I go to Vancouver Island, they've all ceased. So, ferry, float plane, commercial jet to Victoria, those are all shut down. But at least I can still travel via the land border and then take a ferry once I enter British Columbia. But my partner cannot do the same, and it's ridiculous. So we are not tourists. Our binational family is essential, and we need to see each other, and we need to support each other during this difficult time. So something we've been hearing about is outreach to the US government. I was one of those persons that was writing letters to my representatives when this all started. So I want to share a little bit about just a couple sentences I received back in early August from former Representative Denny Heck, who is my local representative. And it resonates with me because I think we know what the solutions are. And so what he wrote back to me is, he said that living with coronavirus becomes a new normal. It is critical that we continue to contain the spread of the virus while also finding ways to adapt and develop safe frameworks for reopening. Given the closeness of our relationship with Canada and the amount of travel between our two countries, it is frankly unclear to me why the federal government has not been able to collaborate with Canada to employ the same kinds of travel practices that we have internally between the states. The US and Canada should craft a plan for reopening the border, as the continual 30-day border closure extensions only create more uncertainty for families, businesses, and communities in Canada and the United States. So that was in early August. My family had already been separated for 5 months. We've now been separated for over 10 months. So when will it stop? These endless 30-day extensions and no means to plan for the future is beyond distressing. These are difficult times, but they don't need to be more difficult by separating families.
Your partner, Bobby, who's in Canada, is in that category of people who can't telework. So is to some extent out there taking risks, keeping a part of the economy going, doing what they need to do, and yet unable to come home and find you or take the weekend and come visit you because of these border restrictions. It's got to be not only an additional risk to some extent for him, but also an additional strain on him just not having you there while he's doing that job.
Yeah.
And I know there are a lot of other people the viewers today will know who are firemen, law enforcement, hospital workers, a lot of frontline workers who haven't been able to sort of stay home and wait. And yet, so they're out there taking risks and are being safe, and to have the added burden of not seeing your family, not having them seems an extra injustice, because we depend on them to do their job every day. And then we put this additional burden on them.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because that aspect has been incredibly frustrating for us. He is an essential worker, but not essential to cross the border.
Not essential to cross the border. It's really very frustrating. Is there, I know you brought this up, maybe you could expand on it. We know that this is a set of restrictions that have been updated every 30 days, or renewed, I guess, every 30 days with some modifications, but it's not a transparent process. We haven't really had any guidance how long this was going to go. And I've heard people in the government, the US government, saying, well, 30 days meant that we thought we might only need it for 30. We would, it would be a short-term thing. And this gave us the ability to update, adapt, modify the policy. We haven't seen much modification, nor have we seen the kind of phase outs that many states have had for their restrictions, saying, well, when the incidence rate is this, or when the number of new infections is that, we'll make a change in policy to adjust to conditions. How is that lack of even just guidance on how this might evolve added to the difficulty of living separated across the border?
Absolutely. There's no end in sight. And, those of us that are binational families of Canada and the US, we never could have imagined that this would be an issue, because like my representative said, we're so close. We don't even consider this a border. We never could have imagined. But these endless renewals of no guidance, right? It's just a closure. There's no path forward. We can't plan our lives. We're years into our relationship and we can't even see each other. It's just ridiculous.
Very frustrating. Very frustrating. If I could bring everyone back, I know some folks have turned off their cameras and I don't blame you, but bring you back just for a couple of questions that we've had from the audience. So if I could ask, you sort of wave your hand to volunteer, coping mechanisms. First of all, what kind of coping has worked for you? I mean, if other people who are having these same separations, a couple of cases you've gotten actually across the border, sometimes you used FaceTime or Zoom or what have you, but what kind of things have helped carry you and your families through this period? Any coping strategies you can share with some of the people with the same situation, but in different parts of the border?
I'll start with two.
Mhm.
First thing is the daily phone call, sometimes on video. That's a very, very big deal. And to be honest, the second one, working for Let Us Reunite and really being able to make a difference for a lot of families,
Mhm.
has, while it wasn't intended as a coping mechanism, it's very therapeutic.
Mhm. Absolutely. Has that been the experience of some of the rest of you? Is that why you joined the campaign?
I joined the campaign to try to help things or create some movement. And I was seeking something out because the advocacy group that I was working with in Canada, they had gotten their exemptions. So I'm like, please, somebody start something. And as soon as I saw Devon, and I'm like, oh, thank God, there's, somebody started something. And so I hopped on the bandwagon as soon as I could, to try to help in any way that I can so that we can get exemptions for us as well.
And I know that happens with a lot of campaigns, and when big business gets to call all the commercial traffic essential, then they step back and they've got what they need and they don't join a broader campaign. And so you have a situation where some people are able to get what they need and then they drop out. For people who aren't suffering in a current division, maybe because of some of what's already been decided, does Let Us Reunite welcome support from people who don't have a personal story, but who have heard this and want to get involved?
Absolutely. So we have a private Facebook group that is strictly for those who are impacted by this, but we also have a public page. And so we would absolutely love anyone who wants to support the movement to join that page. We do weekly calls to action where we ask people to reach out to their elected officials. We post those on our public page too. We would absolutely love it because we need everyone's support if we're going to win this campaign.
Absolutely. And do you have an email address, or you said you had a website? I know I've seen it. It's great. But how can people get in touch with you?
So they can, there's a form on the website that allows them to write us. And we also have an email address. It's info@letusreunite.org. That's the quickest way to get in touch with us.
Excellent. And I'll just add, I know if you email us at canada@wilsoncenter.org, we'll be also happy to put you in touch with Let Us Reunite. And if anybody who is watching this particular broadcast works on Capitol Hill or is in the Washington system and you want to help or even counter and just maybe share some of the complexity that you're trying to wrestle with, we always want to hear from people. We want to try to bring them together as best we can and take the problem and the solution and put them in some sort of close proximity. So we've talked about coping, we've talked about the campaign. We now have this executive order by which Vice President, or now President Biden, has started a process of reviewing these restrictions across all modes of travel worldwide for the United States. What expectations do you have for that process? Has that given you some hope, or are you watching cautiously to see whether you've had so many disappointments with every 30 days, there's just another sad answer, but are you more hopeful now, or are you at this point just sort of wait and see to find out how this process will evolve? How would you characterize how that's made you feel now that we've at least had some action?
I think we're hopeful. We went months and months and months without any conversation or comment from the U.S. government outside of these members of Congress that have been our leaders. We heard nothing from previous administrations on this issue. So I think there is definitely a hope on the campaign. We're starting to get more momentum, or as Cary likes to call it, the snowball. But we've had more meetings in the past 3 weeks than we had in the first 3 months of the campaign with members of Congress who are starting to really realize that this is an issue and that there is a path to victory, as we call it in my world. There is a path to victory here. it might not go as fast as we hope, but I'm very confident that we will get these travel exemptions.
I think the border caucus letter gave at least me a lot of hope. The Michigan letter that is going to be announced today, I think we'll see more letters. I do think the momentum is starting. I do think that this is a piece that gives momentum to the greater dialogue. This is something we can do today that doesn't involve a lot of diplomacy. So very hopeful.
Very hopeful. Excellent. And how has it been for, I know Devon and Cary, you're both sort of living this at the top of the campaign. You're doing this all the time, but I know it's also very personal for Rachel, Aaron, and for Bobby. I'll go in that order. Rachel, are you more optimistic now that you've connected with Let Us Reunite and we've seen some action from President Biden's administration, or at least the promise of action? Are you more hopeful now, or still cautious?
I am very hopeful. It's always proceed with caution, but I am very hopeful. So much more has happened. Like Devon had said, there was nothing happening when the campaign was first started. So seeing where we started and seeing where we are today, I have much more hope.
Oh, fantastic. That's good to hear. Aaron, how about you in Michigan?
Yeah, I agree. I'm hopeful too. In the last, month or so, starting to get responses from senators and congressmen, and seeing some of their names join on the letters that are being sent to the Biden-Harris administration. It's promising. They're starting to see our stories. Newspapers are starting to pick up stories. So I think they're starting to understand that on top of the pandemic that's going on, there's a lot of other issues. There's families that are separated. There's people that need to see each other to be able to get through this. So I'm hopeful that our stories are getting out there and that the right people are going to hear it, and that we're going to get some exemptions soon.
You frame this so well, because I can see the clock behind you, so I know I have to keep the time. But also, as you're talking, you must have stood up, because I can every once in a while just see a little head pop up a little bit. There we are. Hello. Hopefully, before he's walking across the border on his own, that will be back to normal. But very good to see him. Thank you for sharing that. And Bobby, what about you? Are you more hopeful now, or?
I am more hopeful with the administration change, and I feel like we have something that's pretty simple. Like, let's just mirror what Canada's doing. Let's at least start there. Give our families the exemption to be able to cross the border. It's so simple. It's just so simple. Acknowledge the exemptions that we already have, and then there are a lot of other things to work on, but let's just start there. I think there's been a general increased awareness of this issue too. Months ago, people didn't even realize that the border was closed to my partner and I, and like Rachel and Aaron and Cary and Devon have said, more people are aware now in the US, so that helps us.
Absolutely. And to pick up on something that we started with at the very beginning of today's event, this is something that, yes, seems to have changed after all these months and with the Biden-Harris administration just getting started, but in no way is this really a partisan issue. There are Republicans like Elise Stefanik and Democrats who are supporting this because it's something that affects people. This is not a Democrat versus Republican thing, although I live in Washington and sometimes I think everything is a Democrat Republican issue, at least in this town. But this should be one that not only lets us reunite in our families, but maybe even reunite a little bit across that partisan divide that's been so sharp in at least in Washington, D.C. lately. I really have to thank all of you, Devon, Cary, Rachel, Aaron, and Bobby, not only for sharing your stories, which is honest and very moving, but also for acting and not letting that feeling of isolation and frustration kind of freeze you, but trying to make in your own way this continent of ours, this Canada-US relationship, work better by raising the profile of this issue. I don't think it would have been this high without you. not nearly as personal, not as moving. And for anyone who's watching, who's been moved by this program, we really encourage that you reach out to us or reach out to Let Us Reunite. Let Us Reunite has a web page, which is letusreunite.org. Am I correct? Yes. And you can also find us at canada@wilsoncenter.org. We would also be happy to put you all together. But for now, on behalf of all our viewers and the Wilson Center, I want to thank you for your efforts and wish you success.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.